This topic is a little less practical, but I think it's important, especially for those of you who are going to work outside of the regions of France where they speak a standard French, which, as we'll see, is most of France. So on the right, you can see the Ordonnance royale sur le fait de la justice, which is more commonly known as the Ordonnance de Villers-Cotterêts, which is almost, I don't know, close to 200 ordinances, or articles. But the key thing is that the Article 111, roughly in the middle, which says that essentially all acts from courts and other places, whether it's registers, enquêtes, contrats, commissions, sentences, testaments, everything, should be en langue maternelle française et non autrement. So this is the act that is responsible for the shift from Latin to French documents. And there's some debate over the years about whether it's a shift from local languages to French or from Latin to French, but most people, and I think most of the evidence is that it's a shift from Latin to French. And so, though of course we have French documents going back centuries before this, after this point we're going to see a rapid transition to French as the language of documents. And I think there's something maybe general going on because at the same time, in fact, a few months earlier in Geneva, they pass an act saying that all notarial acts shall be in langue vulgaire, which again could mean French or Suisse romande or any non-Latin language, but in this case it means a switch from Latin to French, though the transition's actually happening earlier in notary documents, and it happens about 3 years earlier in the city council registers. But if you look at the city council registers, you can see in red I've got some of the text that's in Latin, and in blue text that's in French, and you can see that the scribe is alternating back and forth between French and Latin, including this middle one where it's Girardin de la Rive, which is the A ending is sort of the kind of influenced by the patois, the local language, but that's his French name, and then it says Odita Gerardino da Ripa. So they give his name in French and in Latin. And if we go to just the next page, you can see Thomas Genot. Thomas Genot was one of the priests of Geneva who stays on in town, and here he's asking to have permission to create an inn or a tavern or something, sous l'enseigne de la barque, en fait, but it's written de la barche. But you can see it's Audita Supplicazione Tomé Genodi Patententi une enseigne de la barche. So right in mid-sentence it switches. And same thing with Pierre. It's about a tutelle. And then right here in the middle of the line it switches from Latin to French. So why is the switch so hard? I think the thing you have to remember is that in most of France and most of Francophonie, French is a foreign language. La France est plus langue, as they said in the podcast that I asked you to listen to. And so the scribe, what you have to realize is that when he's writing in French and when he's writing in Latin, in both cases it's a foreign language. The conversation is probably, most certainly in 1537, the conversation is in the local language. They're speaking Suisse romande, and I don't recall who the secretary is at this point in those registers, but Claude Rosset or Pierre Ruffy, both native Genevans who would be more comfortable in Genevan than in French. And so they're sort of, I think, struggling to keep up, and they're actually more used to translating into Latin. So, in addition to the Latin-French issue, there's, of course, I'm sure you've all know this map, a division of the Pays d'Oc and Pays d'Oil, or as they said in the podcast, Pays d'Amour, which is the south of France, Pays d'Amer, which is the north, right? French is not the... le français n'est pas la langue d'amour. Ça, c'est le provençal, because amour is the Provençal form originally. And, I'm sure you know this line that cuts roughly from Geneva through Lyon to La Rochelle is also the line between droit écrit et droit coutumier, so Roman law and customary law. And there are differences, in food and drink and so forth. And, we all know since Brodel that the south of France is a Mediterranean culture and the north of France is not. But these Français, Provençal, Franco-Provençal, these are language families rather than languages. If you look at this map from 1835, the section with the dots here, those are the only départements in 1835 that are considered wholly French-speaking. So it's 19 out of 85 départements. In 1634, Richelieu creates the Académie Française to expand French and thus royal power. In the middle of the 17th century, when Racine goes down to the Département de Gard in the south, and he asks for pot de chambre, he gets a réchaud, and he has to speak Italian to be understood. Down here, just people do not speak French. During the Revolution, they wanted to find out about the spread of French, and Henri Grégoire in his survey found that 3/4 of the people in France knew some French, but that doesn't mean they spoke French regularly. And again, in 1835, 19 out of 85 départements. A watershed event is when the French are defeated in the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. The central government is appalled to find out that the French peasants in the east of France hid in their houses when the French troops retreated and then ran out with bread and wine for the Prussians. And they blamed it in part on the educational system, and so they got serious about indoctrinating people in the speaking of French throughout the country. And that's when it really accelerates. But even so, in 1877 in Indre-et-Loire, which is really in the heartland of the French language, in the Touraine, its capital is Tours. In 1877, the officier finds that though everyone can speak French, among themselves they speak Touraine. In 1903, a travel writer in Limoges, in the center of France, has trouble finding anyone who speaks French. And if we go all the way to the 20th century in Bretagne, people like the historian Mona Ozouf writing about her childhood, or Pierre Jacques Elias, who has a great book, Cheval d'Orgueil, if you know it. They grew up in Brittany speaking Breton. And in fact, Ozouf says if she spoke French in the home, she got beaten. And if she spoke French in the school, if she spoke Breton in the school, she got beaten. But since her parents were teachers, it was the same people doing the beating. But the point being that through most of France, even at a relatively late date, people are not speaking French. And it's a similar thing in other countries. In England, when they translate the Mass into English, there's rebellions in the North because the people in the North are not able to understand it. They are able to understand the Latin better than the French. So how different are these languages? They are different. A patois is not a small dialect. It's not like French and Quebecois or something like that, or American and British English. It's more like Spanish and Portuguese, or even Spanish and Italian. So here's from Limousin, the south. I don't honestly know how to read most of that. Some of it is obviously con and chac that resembles French, Premiero, but a lot of it is hard to read, and I can't get the sense of it any more than I could with Italian. This is from Picardy, and it's a little closer perhaps. This would be the language that Calvin would have grown up with in Noyon, in sort of relatively central Picardy. Here's an example from 1547. This was a placard put up in Geneva, where probably not actually by Jacques Gruet, but it was put up in the pulpit essentially to threaten the French refugee preachers who were disliked by a lot of the local Genevans. And, again, there's some of it that's obvious, like compagnon and compagnon, but panfard and enfuma and things like that are really just not understandable to us. So the text is not readable. So that's how different these languages are, one from the other. Here's another example of a modern Franco-Provençal. It says from Chambéry ou Grenoble, so it's in that Savoie and Grenoble region. So what's the point of all this? These are quite different languages, and though France is transitioning to French as the language of documents, it's also very slowly transitioning to French as the language of communication in day-to-day speech, but it's going to take a long time. So in the early modern period, most of France is not speaking French. Documents that are in French, that are, say, court testimony or a testament, a will, something like that, that are intended to record the thoughts of a common person, are translations. In most of France, the notary or scribe himself is writing in a foreign language. And so for the paleographer, the main thing that means is a couple of things. First is to expect words from the patois to creep into documents. So you need to learn about the local language in whatever area you're working in. But then also to understand that it is a relatively mediated text. Generally speaking, when we hear somebody quoted in a court document or something like that, it's actually a translation. So as you use these in research, as you use documents in research, it's important to understand the context and the region that they come from. So hopefully that's a helpful background as you look at documents from wherever you decide to work.